So April is National Poetry Month. So in honor of the last week of Poetry Month, we're going to look at poems in sign language. So you will have this assignment here, and this assignment is going to be due by Thursday night. Okay, so what this says to tell you is that ASL Poetry is a performance art. It's an art form utilizing body language, rhythm, and movement to create a three-dimensional pictorial equivalent to an oral poetry. So what that means is that it's almost like a charade type of a activity, and it's three-dimensional because you're using your body, you're using your hand movements, you're using your facial expressions, all of that, to make it equal to what an actual like told poem would be. Okay, so some ways that you can do that are showing alliteration and rhyme. Those are two things that are big in poems. So alliteration is the repetition of sounds. So if I said um, the cat ate cookies and cake and continued to eat until his belly was full. Okay, so the cookies and cake and cat and continued, those all have the same k sound in them. So that's what we call alliteration. So if we did similar hand shapes, that would act as alliteration. Okay, and we'll look for examples of that here in a little bit. And then also using the same exact hand shape over and over, repetitively over and over, works as rhyme. Okay, so if you use the same hand shape over and over and over, then you're basically acting like a rhyme in your poem. Okay, so we're going to take a look at this article right here, Understanding ASL Poetry. So it says here that ASL poetry is poetry created in sign language. Like poetry in any other language, it's an artistic expression of human experiences using the language in a creative way. Poetry in sign language is expressed with hand signs and facial expressions. As a written tradition in sign language is rather rare, as we know. So we don't really write sign language, we show it, right? It says, so long ago, I'm skipping to here. So long ago, people made up stories and poems and performed them before their peers. And the peers then retained or remembered those performances to be able to repeat them somewhere else. And then sometimes there is originality of poems, but what happens is in telling those stories over and over and over, you sort of lose some of that originality. It says, however, since videos and the internet have now become more common, deaf people have taken to recording their creative works and have thus made ASL poetry both easier to preserve and more available for a wider audience than before. Like in English and other languages, ASL poems come in a wide variety. They can be funny, sad, happy, playful, serious, philosophical, which means like something for you to think about, and so on. Sign language poets may use accepted signs in their poems, or they may invent new ones to just as required. New ones is required, just as poets in other languages use existing words and make up new ones. So this makes sign language poetry more flexible than just, a typical ASL story. Okay. So what that means, and this is what I want to focus on right here, is that you guys are going to create a poem, okay? And in your poem, it's important to notice you can use signs that you already know, and you can make up new signs, okay? Just in the way that you make up signs has to be a visual representation of what you're trying to tell us, okay? And we'll watch some examples of that here in a little bit. So I'm just skipping ahead to features of ASL poetry. Okay. So word signs that are expressed poetically by using regular or modified hand movements, palm orientations, and hand locations. So what that means is it's okay if you take a sign that you know and you move it around in a different way. You change the palm orientation, or you change the location of where it is. So an example of that, let's say, might be grandmother. Okay. And let's say that your grandmother has passed away. And so instead of doing grandmother off your chin, you do it up into the sky, like you're talking about grandmother in heaven. Okay. So if you were going to talk about your grandma being in heaven, it would make sense in a poetic way to sign that sign up in the air rather than from your face, or even take it from your face and move it way up into way up above you, as if you're signing to grandma in heaven. Okay. So that's what it means to be poetic. You're going to be very you're going to move more with your signs, and your facial expressions are going to add more to the signs. So let's say you're talking about, again, a grandparent that died. Maybe your facial expression is very, very sad, or maybe you are remembering something, a funny story. And so maybe you, even though you're talking about grandma in heaven, you have a big smile or a laugh, or something like that. Okay. So your facial expressions need to add to the mood of what it is, that the story that you're trying to tell. Um, Again, poetic expressions through mouth and head movements. So that's a part of your expressions. Rhymes or ideas through eye movements and eyebrow movements. So you see, these three right here have a lot to do with what you show me with your face. Okay, with your face and your head and your eyes and your eyebrows, and all of that is really important with ASL poetry. Also, your body movements. So you're not going to just stand still. You need to be flowing and moving. And so, in some ways, it can kind of look like a dance as well. Okay. I'm not saying to just dance, but it can kind of look like that. Here are a couple more things to keep in mind. Different speeds and signing different lines of the poem. So depending on what you're trying to tell us, it says one line, for example, could be signed very fast, and another one could be very slow. Um, Another line could be very jerky, to convey a particular meaning, whatever it is you're trying to show us. If it needs to be jerky or a quick movement, then that's what you can show us. You might have big pauses between your signs to show an important idea. Regular poetic devices like rhyme, rhythm, line, meter, and stanza are also all things that you can include in your poem. So a stanza means like you have a few parts of the poem, like a few words, and then you go on to the next. So maybe you have like 4 or 5 lines of a poem. That's a stanza, and it's expressing one idea. And then you go on to the next 4 or 5 lines of a poem that gives a different idea. So you can do that with your ASL poetry too. Features like classifiers. So remember, we showed you like classifiers for person. I've showed you classifiers for, say, like a car. That's like your a three hand that's sideways, right? With your thumb sticking up in the air. That's a car. Repetition. So doing something over and over. Assimilation means like um, you're making signs look very similar to each other, or you're making them move in the same direction. So you're just sort of kind of bringing it all together. Using things like metaphors, personification, taking on roles and symbols. We're not going to worry too much about that, but taking on the role of something else. Okay, so maybe your poem is about a dog and you take on the role of a dog. Okay, or maybe your poem is about the sun and the symbol is the sun. So you somehow try to make yourself like the sun. Okay, so those are important things and important key features to keep in mind. And that article is linked right here, Understanding ASL Poetry. Okay, so if we take a look at this poem, let's just look at some of the features that he has in here, and we'll talk about that. So first, he's just introducing himself, and he's telling you the title of the poem, okay? So don't worry about that part. So now he's going to start. Click out of those ads. So I want you to see here how he's showing you movement, okay? He is showing shape. So far, he's not really done any signs. He's just sort of miming and bringing in shapes, okay? And doing a lot of movement. His facial expressions are not huge, but one thing that I want you to notice, watch his eyes, okay? Every so often, he kind of squints, as if he might be looking sort of into the distance or watching something. And now you notice he did this before, okay? So repetition, but he did it in a different location and facing a different direction, okay? So the repetition was to show some rhyme in the poetry there. And he keeps doing similar hand shapes. Okay, so his similar hand shapes are acting in that what we talked about, that alliteration, which means the same. If you were to hear something, hearing the same sounds, which is alliteration is a pleasing sound when we are listening. It helps us kind of tune in, so that using the similar hand shapes helps us to kind of watch what's going on there. Okay, and then using the same hand shapes over and over means he's using rhyme. So what I want you to do is watch this poem a few more times, okay? You are going to eventually be creating your own poem through signs and gestures, all right? But for this assignment, what I want you to do is I want you to hit this red submit button up here. So when you hit that, notice this text box comes up, and when you click there, you'll be able to type in it, okay? And what are you typing? So you are going to tell me, first of all, you're going to describe what the poem in the video was about. So watch this a few more times, see if you can figure out what is going on, okay? Now remember, this is a poem. You can't tell me word for word. You cannot translate English poetry into sign language or sign language poetry into English, like an English poem. But what you can do is tell me what the poem was about, okay? So for instance, if he was showing me a lot of things, growing and blowing in the wind and the sun, then you might tell me that the poem was about spring, okay, and things and flowers growing and windy days or something like that. So you don't have to write a poem for this. You just have to tell me what was he telling us about, okay? And then so the first thing you're going to do is just type in here, say the light was about, and then just tell me what it was about. Okay. So I'm just going to put that. Then the next thing you're going to do is tell me what your poem will be about and what techniques will you use to create your poem. Okay. So my poem will be about dot, dot, dot. And then I will use um, the ASL techniques of dot, dot, dot. Okay. And where do we get those techniques? Well, remember in this article over here, these features. Okay. So I'm going to make sure that I have really big hand movements. I'm going to use lots of facial expressions, or I'm going to use big body movements. Okay. Also, these things up here where we talked about using this similar hand shapes or repeating our hand shapes over and over and over. So tell me, and before you type this out, sort of plan your poem. What do you want your poem to be about? Okay. You can make it about anything that you want it to be about and tell me how you might create it. Okay. Once you type all of this stuff in the text box, then you will hit submit assignment and it will submit, and then you will see up here submitted. Okay. And then that's all that you have to do for this assignment. Okay. Now, as you're thinking about what you want your poem to be about, keep in mind, you do not have to write a poem that rhymes. You don't have to think about the actual words of your poem. Okay, think big picture. I want my poem to be about trees. Okay, if your poem's about trees and a forest, think about what happens in a forest, think about what a forest looks like, think about how you would, in a creative, poetic way, tell me about that. You can use some signs that you know, you can make up signs, and you can use gestures like you were doing charades. Okay, maybe your poem is going to be about family, maybe it's going to be about animals. Maybe it's going to be about, getting ready for school. Maybe it's going to be about having to stay at home now all the time. Okay, so you have lots of options. It could be about anything that you want it to be about. Don't write a poem, just tell me what it's going to be about and tell me how you're going to create that. All right, I want you to be thinking about that. I want you to sort of be practicing, developing your poem, look in front of the mirror, make sure you're using good facial expressions. And then later this week, I will show you, I will do one, I'll do an example and I will post it on Canvas. And then we'll make your poem, I'll assign what your requirements are for your poem and make it due for the beginning of next week. All right. So there's your assignment. Let me know if you have any questions and just try to have fun with this.